Okay, guys, what we're going to do now is talk about this flood in Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9, and the flood of Noah. And basically the question of whether or not it was a global flood or a regional flood, and then how that sort of plays out. But there's one little thing we need to go back and talk about back in Genesis 2 that I basically forgot. So let's go back to Genesis 2. So we were talking back here in Genesis 2 about the pre-Adamite view versus the original pair view. And at the end of the chapter, Eve is created in the end of Genesis 2. And so Eve is created, and it says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Okay, so a question that may arise is like, okay, well, if Adam and Eve are not the original pair of humans, then maybe that biblical definition of marriage doesn't apply to all people. So does that apply in a pre-Adamite view? The short answer is, this is a fairly simple question, we just need to address it. Yes, it would still apply because God wanted Adam and Eve to become the basis for what he wanted all humanity to be in a pre-Adamite view. They failed at that. He didn't want them to eat from the fruit of the tree. But when it says, so God created Eve to be with Adam, and so that's why a man, just any generic man, shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. So in other words, like, the biblical definition of marriage is something that God wants for everyone, and God always intended for everyone, but it was something that Adam and Eve were supposed to bring to the world, and they just blew it. So anyway, there you go. Now let's get back to this local flood versus regional flood. Now the issue is, if you take a global flood view, the problem is people who take a global flood view in general think that they have a very strong argument and there's just no argument against their view. That's actually not the case. There's actually no strong argument for a global flood view, and there is an argument in support of a regional flood. When I say argument, I mean a case, a biblical case based on what the Bible says. So from the global flood proponents, their thing is like, if you just take a plain reading of the text, if you just read it. I need to get I just got a bunch of political text messages. That's what I need to know. What I need to vote for. Blah, blah, blah. So anyway, you have a global flood view. Their biggest argument is that if you just read this text, it's just obviously a global flood. Well, let me find. Let's see. How about these three verses here? Genesis 6, 11, 12, and 13. "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was all corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth." Okay, so I read that for you. Now, remember what we talked about earlier. That word earth is the Hebrew word eretz. It's translated as earth. Let's see. So let's just look it up again, just to make sure I get the numbers right. In the King James Bible translation, it is translated as earth 712 times. But it is translated as the word land 1,543 times. So that's more than double, so 712 times 2 would be 1,432, or 24, I mean. So to translate this as land is not only perfectly fine, it's something that more often it's translated as land. Okay, so let's just read those same 3 verses, and let's just translate the word earth as the word land, because when you hear the word earth, you think in English, you think of planet Earth. Although the word in English doesn't, it used to mean the land. And so that's the problem with English. The word earth is kind of taken on a sort of a different meaning. And the problem is in English you have a lot of words that mean the same thing, and they have very subtle flavors of meaning, whereas in Hebrew, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, you have less words, and you have words that serve like double duty or triple duty, and they can be translated as multiple English words, but there's just one word in the original. So let's read those 3 verses and let's just translate it as land. Okay? It says, "And God saw the land, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the land. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the land is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the land." See how, imagine, like, it may help to just go through Genesis 6, 7, and 8, and just, or maybe 9, 2, and just write these down, or type it up or something, and then, so you don't have to write it all by hand. Type it, copy and paste into a text editor, and then change those, and print off the original copy, and then print off with the word earth changed to land every time, and just read it, and just imagine to yourself, what if it was just translated land? Then you wouldn't have any trouble. You probably wouldn't have any trouble seeing this as a local flood, So that's part of the issue. That's a perfectly legitimate translation. More often, it's more than twice of the time the term is translated land. Okay, so sometimes people say, well, all right, proponents of a global flood know what I'm talking about. They're aware of it. But what they say is the earlier Hebrew language uses the word whole or the word all as like a way of like indicating that it's comprehensive totality. So in other words, if you have Eretz, then they would say translate that land. But if they have what's called Kol Eretz, they would say, which Kol Eretz basically translates to like the whole earth, or maybe the whole land, and so they would say, well, that means the entire planet, so translate it that way, because the Hebrew word Kol is there. So then what their argument is that like the word Kol means like, it basically translates into English as the word whole. And so when you have Kol Eretz, then it means the comprehensive totality. So for example, verse 12 that we just read, it says, "And God saw the earth," or God saw the land, "and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth or the land." So that term, all flesh, I don't even know, I haven't even looked this up before. I bet you it's, oh man, I don't have, they don't give you that little preposition. It's probably that word kol. Here's a little trick I'm gonna try. Alright. We'll try a different translation here. I think in Hebrew, anytime it's like all or whole, like that. Yeah. It's very like, I'm pretty sure it's that word kol. So anyway, we'll get to it as we go. I need to move on. That's the argument. Okay, so if we move to chapter 8, in chapter 8, is flood, and then the water starts subsiding. Okay, it says, in chapter 8, verse 5, it says, "And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen." So, therefore, the all the land was not underwater. There's no way if you could see the tops of the mountains. Okay, so the tops of the mountains are seen. All right, and then so at the end of the 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent forth a raven, and it went to and fro in the waters until the waters were dried up from the land or the earth, whichever you go with. Then he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. All right, so again, it's the face of the Eretz, so the face of the land, the face of the earth. It's the same thing. But the dove found no place to set her foot, and she returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put forth his hand and took her and brought her into the ark with him. Or the waters were still on the face of the whole land. Literally, it's kol eretz. So let's just, yeah. Alright, so anyway, the issue is, in this particular case, it's a dead giveaway that kol eretz doesn't mean, if you have the word kol in front of eretz, which would basically literally translate to like the whole land. So they would say, well, translate that earth because it's planet Earth. Well, the issue is there's no way here that it means comprehensive totality because the tops of mountains were seen. So, but then later on it says the dove returned because the water still covered the face of the whole eretz, the kol eretz. So the bottom line is you can't take it that way. It doesn't necessarily mean comprehensive totality. Just like back in Genesis 2, it said that the river Pihon, or Pishon, I can't remember if there's an S or not, but it flows through the whole land of Havilah. Well, when you read that, it's the same word again. It's just kol eretz of Havilah. So, I don't know. There you go. You've got later in Genesis when, the whole earth is under a famine in the days of Joseph. Well, it doesn't mean literally the whole earth. So anyway, given that, it's like, okay, we could take it either way. It says, so then what other arguments do the proponents of a global flood have? Well, they have that, the water was very, let's see here. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. Well, the Hebrew word for mountain and for hill is the same word. Either way, this would have been a massive flood, but it could have been a very massive local flood. It doesn't have to be, when it says the mountains, it could just mean the mountains where he was at or the hills where he was at. It doesn't have to mean, 15 cubits, cubits a foot and a half, so 15 times 2 plus another 7.5 of that, so like that would be 30 feet, but Bay of like 47.5 feet, which is incredibly deep, but it's a deep flood. It could be a deep local flood, and that's over the tops of mountaintops, so that would have to be a gigantic flood locally. But so anyway, there's that. We're going to take a look. There is a flood that fits the bill. We're going to take a look at the scientific evidence for that. But let's take a look at the remaining arguments in defense of a global flood. The only other one I know of that really is worth mentioning, I mean, they have like ones that like a kindergartner can see through, I guess. Everybody's got some kind of something, they say, But as far as the serious ones, one of the ones is this issue of after the flood, God makes a promise about a rainbow, and when the bow is in the cloud, this is Genesis 9:16. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And the water shall never, in the previous verse, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. So, here's the thing, if this is a local flood, then you would have to say like, well, other local floods happened, so God didn't keep the promise. So the concept of this promise would have to be a flood that there has never been another flood like that since. And there's sort of two ways to take it, because now you run into a problem. It's like, okay, well, in a pre-Adamite view, the people who lived where Noah lived would have been the descendants of Adam and Eve, and there would have been other people on the planet who God wasn't upset with, but God would have been more upset with the descendants of Adam and Eve, possibly pitching in on leading the world into corruption, becoming more corrupt. And so it's more, a local flood would make sense because those are the people who are the ones God is primarily upset with. So, there's that. Now, if you take an original pair view, then you could say, like, well, all humans, lived in one place and had failed to disperse over the earth. And so a local flood would be comprehensive to humanity, but not comprehensive to the globe. So you could take that view. Or, here's a third possible view. There's two ways to take the original pair view. So you could say in the original pair view that, there were humans in other parts of the planet, but God was just really upset with what was going on here because of the reasons that we've previously talked about, how bad things were and the corruption that the humans were getting into because of, the evil. So, in that particular view, you would still have to have a flood. It would have to be a flood like which there has never been. You can't have that. This can't be like just any old flood. Well, there is scientific evidence as of 2014 for just such a flood. So let me get the notes over here so that I can get for you the actual correct name of the scholarly article, the scientific journal article, so you can because the guy's got some good pictures. But essentially, what this is a 2014 paper that was published, and he gathered research from all over Arabia. And why is that relevant? Remember what we said. The scientific evidence for this Persian Gulf oasis is been in for a long time. That what has now been flooded under the Persian Gulf was a freshwater river and lake system with springs. It would have been an astonishing oasis in the middle of the Arabian desert. Okay. So, it got flooded, clearly because it's under the Persian Gulf now. The amount of land that would have been dry land is estimated to be about the size of Great Britain. And it's well known, it's well documented. There's no question that this was a center of early human civilization and possibly a basis for how civilization started. That's the archaeologists are certain about that it was that. Because, remember, it wasn't, 11,500 years ago, it was definitely flooded by that point. Well, in that period, I guess, from 13,000 to 8,000. Well, shortly after that, you have the first civilization starting in a little to the north in Mesopotamia. So, here's the thing. It was flooded, okay? Was it flooded catastrophically, or was this a slow increase in ocean water? Alright, so the paper that I'm going to share with you says that the evidence indicates not only was it flooded, but from what I can tell looking at the photos that he has in his paper, he gathered evidence from all over basically Arabia. I think he didn't go into Iraq and gather evidence. So the flood could have actually extended up through the Fertile Crescent up to Assyria. But he's got based on his research and the photo and the models that he has in his paper, this flood that he says happened sometime between 13,000 and 8,000 years ago, before now. So basically, 8,000 years ago would be 6,000 BC, and 13,000 years ago would be 1100 BC. He says that between those times, a flood happened, and he says the photos he has, it appears to be about, I would guesstimate, about a third to a half of Arabia he's got underwater. And you see, the thing is, if you go further north into Iraq, you know, that's a floodplain from a very ancient flood 5.5 million years ago. So that's a whole other flood that happened 5.5 million years ago that was way bigger. So 5.5 million years ago, the Mediterranean Sea was dry, and there was a dam at the Strait of Gibraltar, and it busted through, and it carved the Strait of Gibraltar really deep, and the whole thing filled up catastrophically, and the overflow of water just rushed right through Israel, through Syria, took a turn because it hits mountains as it tries to keep going east, and it turned south and went to, you know, where the Persian Gulf would be, and fed out into the Indian Ocean. So, like, that's all an ancient floodplain. The Fertile Crescent is an ancient floodplain. So, like, it's not unthinkable. You know, his evidence in this paper, the paper is called The Geomorphological and Hydrogeological Evidences for a Holocene Deluge in Arabia, 2014, by Mohammed El Bastawesi. I don't know how to pronounce that Arabic word, but it's Bastawesy. And I was able to get the paper for free online, so search around and you can see it. He even says, 8,500 years ago to 13,000 years ago, that the evidence he collected suggests what he saw, what he collected. He went all throughout Arabia gathering evidence, that it was a rapid flood. This was a rapid event. So there's that. It wouldn't have gone over into Persia because there's mountains right there. But so this would have been the center of human civilization, of early human civilization, and it was all flooded. And according to the evidence this guy gathered, it's a gigantic flood like which the world has never seen. And in the middle of the desert where it doesn't rain, this water system, rivers are life. And so, like, it's not just that one of the big killers is that this would have been a saltwater flood. And in other words, what would have happened is, about 11,500 years ago, the earth warmed up tremendously and ocean levels began to rise, and there would have been some sort of natural dam keeping the Persian Gulf from filling up with water that all of a sudden broke. And then a massive amount of water would have spilled over, and it would have all been salt water. And the thing is, animals and humans can't drink salt water. And plants that can grow in salt water are a totally different kind of plants. So you have a freshwater ecosystem and a huge oasis in the middle of the desert in essentially the land of Eden. I mean, to this day, the Iraqis, the inhabitants of Iraq, call the land where the Tigris and Euphrates meet Eden. Okay, and it would have all been flooded with a catastrophic flood that, I mean, from the pictures I saw, this would have been the biggest flood in human, that humans ever had to deal with. And it would have killed all life. I mean, animals would have had to, it would have completely, their migration routes would have been completely based, where would they go for water now? Especially if it went further north up into the, up towards Syria, up through the Fertile Crescent, then like where would they go for water? What, like thousands of miles in other directions? No, they're just going to die. They don't have any, So it's weird to think about, but it's like, the plants are going to die, the animals are going to die, and people are going to die, not just because they're drowning, but because there's no water in the flood, because it's a saltwater flood. So it's not a freshwater flood, it's a saltwater flood. You know, when it says in Genesis that the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and there was rain, and then the fountains of the great deep burst forth. Okay, the rain would have been, you know, fresh water, but the fountains of the great deep, I mean, that's their way of, that's how they describe the ocean, the great deep. Because in the ancient world, they actually thought it went under the land, and it was the great deep. You know, so when you went out on the ocean in a boat, you're going, like, to them, that was like outer space. But like, there we go. There has never been a flood like that. You know, whenever there's been bad floods in human history, and they've killed people, and they've killed lots of people, but there's never been anything like that, you know, where nobody got away, you know, except for one guy who would have had a boat. All right, so hopefully that answers that question, and now we have to get to perhaps the biggest question, the biggest thing we're going to talk about, which is something that, you know, we're going to talk about polytheism. All right, so polytheism versus monotheism, and what I was taught growing up in church is that the gods of the other nations don't exist, and that was what I was taught, that, you know, the God Yahweh, you know, the God of the Old Testament, the Creator God, God the Father, Jesus the Son exist, and the gods of other nations don't exist. Okay, and then I ran into a problem when I read this verse when I was younger. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 17. And we're actually going to be in a bunch of Deuteronomy as we talk about this. It says that it's talking about people who rejected Yahweh, and it says, they sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. So it's clear in the New Testament that demons exist. And then this verse makes a connection between demons and the gods of the other nations. The people literally are making sacrifices to demons. Okay, and so it's like, all of that clicked for me. I was like, wait a minute, well, that makes perfect sense. If I was the devil and I wanted to lead people, you know, away from Yahweh, what I would want to do is install myself as their God and have them worship me and obey me and do what I say. You know, it makes perfect sense, and it's blatantly what it's saying here. But then you run into this question of, like, you don't see the word demon very much in the Old Testament. So, like, let's look it up. I mean, I'm not sure if you ever see it outside of this. Alright, so the King James translates it as devils. So the word is shadim. And it appears that it only appears in the Old Testament 2 times. Let's see. Psalm 106 is the other appearance of this word. So this word's shadim. Alright. So now we're looking up Psalm 106. Okay. And verse 37. And it says, oh, wow. So this is God complaining about the people of Israel and how you need to follow him. And then it recounts the past. And it's talking about the people in the day that the psalm was written. They're talking about how you need to follow God and you need to do the right thing. And then it makes a comparison to the past, and it says, both we and, this is verse 6, both we and our fathers have sinned. We have committed iniquity, we have done wickedness. Our fathers, when they were in Egypt, did not consider your wondrous works. That would be Yahweh. They did not remember the abundance of your steadfast love, but they rebelled by the sea, at the Red Sea. Yet he saved them for his name's sake, that he might make known his mighty power. He rebuked the sea, and it became dry, and he led them through the deep as through a desert. So he saved them from the hand of the foe, and redeemed them from the power of the enemy. And the waters covered their adversaries, not one of them was left. Then they believed his words, they sang his praise. But they soon forgot his works. So remember, they walked through the Red Sea, and after that happens, they do sing a praise song to Yahweh. But then, when Moses is up getting the laws from Yahweh, they decide to worship the golden calf, and the text has like a metaphorical euphemism that they were having a big orgy. And Moses comes down and he's not happy. He breaks the tablets that the law are written on. There's a bunch of stuff happens. But anyway, it says, but they soon forgot his works. They did not wait for his counsel, but they had a wanton craving in the wilderness, and put God to the test in the desert. He gave them what they asked, but sent a wasting disease among them. When the men in the camp were jealous of Moses and Aaron, the Holy One of Yahweh, the earth opened up and swallowed up Dathan and covered the company of Abiram. Something else that happened there. Fire also broke out in their company, and the flame burned up the wicked. They made a calf in Horeb, the golden calf at Mount Sinai. Horeb's another name for Mount Sinai, and worshipped a metal image. They exchanged the glory of God for an image of an ox that eats grass. They forgot God, their Savior, who had done great things in Egypt. Savior doesn't mean Jesus Christ here. It means like he literally saved them from slavery in Egypt. Okay, wondrous hands in the lands of Ham, and awesome deeds by the Red Sea. Therefore he said he would destroy them, had not Moses, his chosen one, stood in the breach before him, to turn away his wrath from destroying them. Then they despised the pleasant land, having no faith in his promise. They murmured in their tents, and did not obey the voice of Yahweh, the Lord, but Yahweh. I'm just translating it. Right? Therefore he raised his hand and swore to them that he would make them fall in the wilderness, and would make their offspring fall among the nations, scattering them among the lands. All right. Then they yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor. Baal is one of the Canaanite gods, the chief gods of the Canaanites, and especially in the city of Ziggurat, which has clear connections to the Hebrew language because they have the same alphabet and basically the same language. It says, they provoked Yahweh to anger with their deeds, and a plague broke out among them. Then Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was stayed, and that was counted to him as righteousness from generation to generation forever. They angered him at the waters of Meribah, and it went ill with Moses on their account, for they made his spirit bitter, and he spoke rashly with his lips. They did not destroy the peoples. So, destroy the peoples has to do with there were commands to go into Canaan, and there were certain people groups that God had deemed for destruction. With that raises all sorts of questions that we can't address, but I'm just kind of making it clear. He's jumping throughout Israelite history talking about the mistakes that they made in the past. So it says, they did not destroy the peoples as Yahweh commanded them, but they mixed with the nations and learned to do as they did. They served their idols, which became a snare to them. They sacrificed their sons. So in the Canaanite religions of Baal, you would sacrifice your children to the god Moloch by burning them in a fire. So it says, they served their idols, which became a snare to them. They sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons. They poured out innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with blood. So again, this term shadim is used here, and I think it really makes the point that I'm trying to talk about. So the question is, like, well, what does the term shadim mean? It means like a super. This is what I'm getting from various sources. It just means like a random supernatural being. The term doesn't really have a negative connotation. the Bible seems to always, in the Old Testament, tends to use it for in a negative sense, but it just means like a supernatural being. And actually, the word demon comes from a Greek word that is just a generic term for just any supernatural being. But in the Second Temple period of literature, the Hebrews created their systems of theology and simplified the terminology. So where they use the term angelos, which means messenger, and yes, God has messengers, which is an occupational term, but they turned that into just what team you're on, the good guy team. And then they took the word demon, which is a Greek word, which just means any supernatural being, which is the same thing that the term shadim means in the Old Testament, which just means any supernatural being. And then in the Second Temple period, they just use that word to sum up to say anybody who's on the bad side, any supernatural beings on the bad side. So then we get angels and demons in this distinction. Okay, so like, and then in the New Testament, they're using that terminology. It's not. It's just makes things simpler. You know, it's less complicated, and it's less rich, but it's also, it simplifies and cuts to the chase of this. So there you have it. Now, that's not all, because as we get into the Tower of Babel story, the important point to make here is that from the biblical perspective, it's not that these gods don't exist. That would not be accurate. It's not that the gods of other nations don't exist. It's that they don't compare to Yahweh. So for example, let's see. All right, here's a. All right, so let's go back to Deuteronomy 32 for this. This will be helpful. There are various what's called denial statements. Deuteronomy 32 and 39 will be the one we can use. It says, "See now that I, even I, am He. There is no God beside me. I kill and make alive. I wound and heal, and there is none that can deliver out of my hand." Which, in English, we read that and it's like, oh, okay, well, God's the only God. There are no other gods. Other gods don't exist. Which is a little bit confusing because these other verses told us that, like, the gods of other nations, the idols that people sacrifice to, they're making sacrifices to demons. You know, to supernatural beings, to evil ones. So, like, okay, the Bible seems like it's contradicting itself here because it says that clearly these other beings exist, and then it says there is no God besides God. Well, it's not really contradicting itself because in their sort of lingo, when you would say there is none besides me, you don't mean that there literally is none besides you. It means there's no one like you. So that was just how they talked. It was just a way that they spoke. And here's a couple examples for you coming from the book of Isaiah. So just to kind of make the point. All right. Isaiah 47 is criticizing, I think, the city of Babylon. Yeah, the city of Babylon. And so verse 8 says this, God is condemning Babylon, and he's saying, you said this about yourself, but then, you know, basically what God does and what Isaiah prophesies is that Babylon says, look at me, I'm awesome, and then Yahweh says, no, you're gonna get tore up and beat up and destroyed, you know, okay, basically, but it does it in their lingo. So Isaiah 47:8 says, now therefore hear this, you lover of pleasures, who sit securely, who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. Okay, so the thing is, that indicates to us that terminology, there's no way that the Babylonians thought that there were no other nations or there were no other kingdoms. And they went out and conquered other kingdoms. They eventually conquered God's chosen people. and then they were conquered by the Persians. They didn't think, that like there were no other nations. There's no other cities besides our city. Like, no, it was just a way of saying that, like, we are so far beyond you that, like, there's just no one like us. It means like utter uniqueness. So, or then it says the same thing again in verse 10. It says, you felt secure in your wickedness. You said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge led you astray. And you said in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. So those are just a couple examples. We actually could use more examples. I've got a little list here from a website. Zephaniah chapter 2 is another one. Or Nineveh says the same thing. Let's take a look at it. Zephaniah 2. Oh. It gave me a word search. We're about to get it. Zephaniah chapter 2. Alright. Alright. And then, so this is this is Nineveh, which is in Assyria. It's not Babylon. It says, this is the exultant city that lives securely, that said in her heart, I am, and there is no one else. What desolation she has become, a lair for wild beasts. Everyone who passes by her hisses and shakes her fist. So hopefully that makes it clear. Well, what that does is it helps us make a further point. So like back in Deuteronomy when it says, Yahweh says, see now that I, even I am he, and there is no God besides me. I kill and make alive, I wound and heal, and there is none that can deliver out of my hand. He's not saying that, it's not saying that he's the only one that exists. It's saying that he's utterly incomparable to everyone else. And it's important to understand that, like, the view of monotheism in the Bible is not that the gods of other nations don't exist, but it's rather that there is no comparison between them and Yahweh. And, I made this point before, but like I said, I found a pencil on the ground the other day. Well, that pencil on the ground is greater and more glorious than a non-existent God. So it's kind of a moot point to say that, like, oh, you're greater, then it kind of denigrates God in a way. Okay, so anyway, that being said, that helps us kind of establish the Old Testament view of monotheism is not that the other gods of other nations don't exist, but rather that there just is no comparison, and that they have been judged as bad, and that Yahweh is good, that Yahweh is more powerful, and that whatever Yahweh says goes, essentially is the idea that's right here in Deuteronomy 32:39. That when Yahweh says, what he says goes, and that's that. And then what we saw in Psalm 106 was that the gods of other nations, we'll see it in other stuff that we talk about, they're not good. They're bad. They don't want good for you, and they just want to corrupt the earth. They're bad. Okay, so that would be a biblical monotheism. Okay, not that the other gods don't exist, but rather that they shouldn't be worshipped. Only your God is the only God you worship. Okay, so anyway, God is often referred to as the Most High. It's an interesting question. Mormons believe that, like, the universe is filled with countless gods on countless planets who are all perfect because that's how they got to be gods, and they would never disagree with each other, never fight each other. But one question, to ask, I guess, if the situation comes up is, like, do you believe there's a Most High God? Because the Old Testament is filled all throughout with references to Yahweh as the Most High. So that's an interesting question. Anyway, that being said, there's more to the Old Testament view of polytheism than just that the other gods of other nations exist. In the Old Testament view, it's not just that. In addition to that, it's this is what Genesis 10 and 11, the Tower of Babel story, as well as, so Genesis 10 talks about the dispersing of the nations after the flood, and then 11 goes into detail about how that happened. Okay, but 10 talks about sort of the genealogically how all of these different nations trace back to Noah. Okay, and those nations are they're all Genesis 10. The nations in Genesis 10 are all they're all known today. It's not like we don't know who these nations are. They're known through our study of ancient history and the cultures back then. It's basically from like Persia to Spain. So that would be another indicator of a local flood. Okay, that the people who dispersed from the flood dispersed from Spain to Persia and everywhere in between, not going beyond, down to Ethiopia, and that's about as far south, across North Africa and the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East, so Arabia, all that. So there's one more big point to make about the old local flood, and I can't believe I forgot. The Bible makes a case, there is a biblical case here, and it's a strong one that can be made that the flood was local. And I forgot to even talk about this. But Psalm 104, just 2 Psalms before the Psalm we were talking about. Psalm 104 in verse 5, it says that, it talks about Yahweh, and it says that He set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth or the Eretz. Okay, so here's the issue. In Genesis 1, when God creates the world, it's very clear that it's covered with water, and then mountains and dry land pushes up out of the water. And according to Psalm 104, when that happened, the land was never again covered with water. So that would be a clear indicator that there was no global flood, and that the correct view, since you can take Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 to be either local or global, you're going to have to take it as local, because Psalm 104 says that the whole earth was flooded at creation, and then once dry land appeared, that was that. Well, okay. And I was interested. I was like, what on earth? This is like really bad for the global flood view. This is kind of a deal breaker for that view. And like, what do they say? How do they deal with this? Surely. So I went over to see, like, what do they have to say about this? And like, because I want to hear what, I like to hear both sides of things. And what they had to say was not impressive. They take that verse that says, you set a boundary that they may not pass, so they might not again cover the earth. And they say, that's talking about after the flood. So they make a timing argument that these verses I just read for you are not describing creation, they're describing the flood. Well, the problem is when it says that God set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved, that's creation. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. Okay, Genesis says, the world was covered with water and dry land pushed out of the water at creation. And by the way, scientifically, there is scientific evidence for that originally the whole earth was covered with water because the ground was very flat and that dry land pushed up out of the water. Okay, so they're just kind of drawing that out of thin air. What they would have to do is say that, like, these verses, start with talking about creation, but then they somehow have a huge skip in here to talking about the flood. And that's just something that they've just kind of read in between the lines here, that if you just read this for what it says, if you go with, again, use their terminology, the plain reading of the text. The plain reading of the text is that you can take the flood in Genesis either way, but you can only take this as talking about creation. And it says that at creation, when dry land pushed out of the water, it was never again covered. Okay, so there's that. Anyway, let's get back to Genesis 10. We've got this dispersal of the nations, and then we've got what happens at Babel in Genesis 11. So, there's so there's 70 nations in Genesis 10. They're the nations that disperse around the earth, but 11 goes into more detail about how that happened. It says, now the whole earth, or the whole land, or remember the whole land, had one language and the same words. So again, in a pre-Adamic view, this could be just, Babel could just, when it says the whole earth had one language, or the whole land had one language, that could be referring to just the people that God intended. He wanted them to go out and make the world fit to be in His presence. And they've gotten really off track, but the thing is, God never gives up on what He says He's going to do. He does it. He doesn't give up. So there's that. Then you've got an original pair view where Adam and Eve are the original two humans. And in that view, you could say, well, perhaps the flood killed all the humans who were all living regionally in Eden, and then they had failed to disperse, and they all had one language. Alternatively, in an original pair view, you could just say, all right, when it says the whole earth had one language, it's the whole land had one language, and Babel is not really about the creation of all the world's languages. It's just talking about a particularly bad thing that happened in a particular place that God was not happy with. Okay. So, all of those views are in there. That's how, given which, you've got two versions of the original pair view there, and then you've got the pre-Adamic view, and, given on which one you go with, that's how you would take the Babel story as a local event. Well, it still would be a local event, no matter what, because it's literally happening at one place. But in a pre-Adamic view, this creation of the nations wouldn't be all of the peoples of the earth. It would be specific nations that God created for specific reasons. And that's going to come out as we go through this. So let's just go through this. It says, as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, which is the Hebrew word for Samaria. And Samaria is the people that live there. The Sumerians mean the dark-haired people, and settled there. So that's just southern Iraq. Okay, that's southern Mesopotamia. The earliest known cities in the world are there. Eridu and Uruk are the two oldest. Uruk is generally considered to be the oldest. Eridu is right there with it. It says, and they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly, and had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. So yeah, bricks, you have to get clay. You can't get any kind of dirt, and then you have to bake them. Whereas concrete is a chemical reaction with limestone. Once you heat it up and mix it with water, just a little bit of water, then the reaction semi takes place. Then you mix it with sand and gravel, and then once you mix more water with it, it'll react with the water. So concrete's totally different from bricks. Like concrete, if you put a wet concrete in a cup and then submerge it in a 5-gallon bucket, it will set up underwater stronger than it will outside of the water. Almost 3 times as strong. So concrete's very different. And then asphalt is a totally different thing, where you just have hot tar and you mix that with rocks, and then it's very flexible, and the tar just kind of gets stiffer with the rocks in it. Now, so when it says, come let us make bricks, all right, so you can't get any dirt, you have to get clay, and then you have to bake it. You have to make the molds, you have to bake it. And it says they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Bitumen is tar. Okay, so they go to the tar pit. All right, so there we go. So the mortar is not, you see, mortar that we use today for bricks is not tar. It's actually just limestone cement mixed with sand. Well, limestone cement mixed with sand and mixed with concrete and mixed with gravel, that is concrete. So they didn't have the mortar cement that we have today. The Romans, as far as I know, the Romans were the ones who invented concrete. You just take limestone and you get it real hot, and then you mix it with a little bit of water, and then you mix it with sand and mix it with water, and you've got mortar, for bricks to put bricks together, and you mix it with sand and rocks, and now you got concrete. And so it works totally differently. And they could build some cool stuff with it. All right, so they use tar for a mortar, which is more flexible. That's actually how we build asphalt roads, but the strength properties are way less. Alternatively, you can just try to fit rocks together really well, but that can be an issue if you don't know how the rock. So in the ancient world, they would fit rocks together, but then the Egyptians eventually developed the ability to cut the rocks with some precision so that they could build tall stuff out of the rocks. But though, that's a whole other issue. So random engineering nonsense. But these bricks and these buildings built, this way with bricks and then tar for mortar would have been nowhere near as strong as a concrete building. And then if you have a concrete building that's reinforced with steel in the concrete, then you get drastic strength increases, which they definitely didn't have. So anyway, there we go. It says, "Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Okay, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth, or the coal Eretz, or the whole land.'" So it could be now the whole land had one language in the same words, and then they said, "Let us build a tower and make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole land." Like either way, you can translate it either way. That's just the bottom line. You have to look into the context to understand, exactly how to take it. All right, so when they want to build a city with a tower, okay, in Sumeria, every city had a tower. This is incredibly familiar. They're called Ziggurats. And the whole point of the towers was that the whole point of Ziggurats, like every city, you didn't have a city if you didn't have a Ziggurat. It was in the center of every city. And the Ziggurat would be built on the ground, and then the top of it would be real high and up in the sky. And in the mind of the ancient peoples, the sky was the divine realm where the gods lived. And the earth, the land, was the human realm where the humans lived. Okay? And the whole point of the Ziggurat was to connect the two regions. And it was not so that, the point of Ziggurats was not so that humans could go up there and get up there to the God realm. The point of the Ziggurats was so that the gods would come down to you. That was the point. It was to bring the God down. So in other words, when they want to make a name for themselves, they want to have the God present in their city. So that they can, be big shots. So then it becomes quite clear. It's like, okay, this is pretty sinful. Okay, so on one hand, it's like, well, this sounds very familiar to what happened before the flood. It says, remember, the sons of God saw the daughters of women were beautiful. They left their abode. They came down and mated with them. So it seems like they're trying to recreate that event. Okay. And then it says, "And Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built." So this is a polemic, because the fact that Yahweh had to come down to see the tower means that the tower wasn't that tall. So the people thought, "Oh, look at our tower. It reaches to the heavens. It's all the way up there." But Yahweh, what Genesis is saying is actually Yahweh had to come way down just to even see the top of your tower. Okay. He's so far above it. So the issue is, it seems like they're trying to recreate, basically the Nephilim Apkallu thing. And the problem is, like, this is highly immoral. And there's an additional problem to this, like, the presence of Yahweh coming down to this. Like, in other words, these people are now just using the presence of God, or whichever God, they're thinking about, as a way to boost their own ego and their reputation with other people around the world. So, like, in other words, like, this is this is something that's very familiar to us today. People who want to say that they're Christian and, use Jesus, use the church, use Christianity as a way, to build up their own reputation. They want to use God in that way. They don't want to, this isn't like I want to have a relationship with the God, and I don't want to, this isn't like, I want to serve the God. This will make me have a great name by having the God's presence in my town. I want, it's like, when a famous person grows up in a little small town, and then they name a road after him, and they want everybody to know this is the town that so and so's from, and they kind of had that like whole 9 yards there. They would just want to use that person for their own glory. Okay, so you can see why God would be upset with what's going on here. This is not good. Okay, and it's one of those things that like is kind of unclear to us today. But if you understand what Ziggurats were and the purpose of Ziggurats, it's like, yeah, this is bad. Okay, so and Yahweh, this is verse 6 says, and Yahweh said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. Not they all have, but they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. So it's easy to take that to mean like, look how tall their tower is. It's so tall. Who knows what they'll build next? And we've got to keep them from becoming too powerful. We've got to, hold back human technology. Like this is some sort of Zeus and Prometheus thing. I don't know if you know that the story is like Zeus didn't want the humans to become too powerful, and so he didn't want them to get fire, which is the first technology. Prometheus wanted the humans to have technology, and so the story plays out after that. With Pandora and Prometheus being punished. With the eagles and blah blah. Probably not the thing here, because there's also a moral aspect of like, this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Probably should be taken morally. In other words, like any evil thought that comes into their head, they won't. In other words, like what he's saying is these people don't have any moral boundaries. They have no moral boundaries. They're already doing this. They're already trying to use the God's presence and potentially His presence as a way to just boost their own ego. And if that's what they're already doing, then they have no moral boundaries. They're just gonna keep going and so in that situation it makes sense. Like they don't need to be in Yahweh's presence. They need to be on some sort of, they need to be meeting, if God's going to communicate with them, it needs to be through some sort of lower level guy. Okay. Like they don't need to be coming directly into God's presence because they just want to use that to boost their own ego. It makes sense to like, okay, well, we're going to give you you're going to be, so anyway, it says, come, let us go down there and confuse their language. So again, who's the us? Well, yeah, who's the us there? Let us go down there and confuse their language. Who's the us? Well, what we find out in Deuteronomy 32, is that the us are, it says in Deuteronomy 32 that the us are the sons of God. Okay, so there were sons of God back in Genesis 6 who left their proper dwelling and became rebels against God and joined up with the serpent's rebellion. But that doesn't mean that God has no more, sons in his in official sons and sort of thing. So that would be the indication there that God has a court. I guess you could say like a king or like a ruler. And he's like, okay, what we're going to do is go down there and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. So Deuteronomy 32, it talks about this Babel event. Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, it says, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind. Okay. He fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. So in other words, like, this is God's creation of the nations here. That's what Genesis 11 is talking about. He's dispersing people, and they're each going to be separate nations. That's what Genesis 10 is talking about. The different nations that descended from Noah. Well, God caused that to happen. Okay. And, or Yahweh caused that to happen. And, each nation has an inheritance. In other words, like, he's disinheriting them from his direct presence and putting them in charge of particular land. And he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. So the idea there would be that because there's one nation that has, it says he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. In other words, that like there's one nation for each son of God. And back in Genesis 10, there's that 70. Although some versions of the Old Testament, it's 72. Some translations of your Bible are going to read sons of Israel here. I'm not going to go into the academic debate about that, but as best I can understand, I'm reading from the ESV. It's got sons of God, and that is now considered to be the correct. So the details of that debate are interesting, but I don't think I should really be the one going into that for this video, especially since the ESV is okay with sons of God. And let's just see. The NIV tends to update itself. Let's see what it says. It says sons of Israel still, and it has a footnote. The footnote says Masoretic text reads sons of Israel, but then the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint are sons of God. So that's the debate. The issue is that the oldest complete copy of the Old Testament that we have is the Masoretic text, which dates to 800 AD. And we have the Dead Sea Scrolls copies of some of the books of the Old Testament, and those date to 800 years earlier, Jesus' time. And then we have a translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. So it's not a Hebrew copy, but it's a translation into Greek from Hebrew that's older than any of our Hebrew copies, and it goes with sons of God. So I mean, like, that's kind of where the debate's at. I think it's like a simple mistake in Hebrew language, but I don't know enough to like know that. But there's wonderful articles you can read online about that. So anyway, the implication here would be that since they're divided up based on a number of how many sons of God there are, then each of the sons of God would be in charge of each of the nations. So this, in essence, becomes a group of nations, each with their own God, and they form a group of gods who rule the nations. This is Yahweh creating a pantheon, and he's giving the nations their inheritance, but he's also disinheriting them from his presence, because the next verse in Deuteronomy 32 says, but Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. So the presence of Yahweh is going to be the inheritance of Jacob, who he renamed Israel, so the Israelites. Okay, so Yahweh fixed the borders of the peoples according to the sons of God. So there is like a literal geographical area of land that each nation has authority to rule. It's given to them by a God, for lack of a better word, who got it from Yahweh. Okay. because Yahweh is not happy with how things are going. These people are not fit to be in his presence. And what he's going to do in the next chapter, chapter 12, he's going to call Abraham to be the father of the Israelites. And so here's the thing. In this view, the whole world has now been disinherited from God's presence, and they've been put under sub-gods that Yahweh assigned to them. And then what he's going to do is he's going to call up Israel as his direct inheritor, and then he wants them to go back and reclaim this. So the view here in Genesis and in the Old Testament is that the whole world was assigned by God to other gods to rule, and then the governments of those nations. In the ancient world, the government of all the nations, they saw the authority of the government as something that was granted to them by the gods. So, like, for example, when the Babylonians, conquered Sumeria, they saw it as their god Marduk being the chief god and giving them that authority. In Rome, they had the same thing, thousands of years later. In fact, the Roman word, which is where our word religion comes from, in Latin it means like that which connects the people to the government. So, like, there was no concept of separation of church and state. In the ancient world, the God was the one who put the government in charge. And so the God had real authority to do things through the government. The government was, just like the president of the United States has the authority to invade a nation and conquer it and kill people, but he doesn't actually do anything other than tell other people to do it for him. So that's the same idea. Just like the emperor of Rome doesn't literally go and take over some province and conquer it. He has an army that does that for him. It was the same idea here. These sons of God, would they have showed up sometimes? And there's no reason to think that they didn't, because Yahweh certainly does. So anyway, but at the same time, their authority would have been that the government received authority from them. Okay? Alright, so therefore the name of the city was called Babel, and because from there Yahweh confused the language of all the earth or all the land. And from there Yahweh dispersed them over the face of all the earth or all the land. Okay. Which, that's the table of nations from Genesis 10. Okay, so Babel is just another, I think Babylon is actually the Greek name for the city, but it's actually just called Babel in Hebrew, and then but there's a bit of a debate, because from what I saw in some places, the city of Eridu used to be, now there's evidence that it used to be called Babylon or Babel, and so that would make it a prime candidate. It's the second ever, as far as we know, it's the second human city. And it used to be named Babylon, and so the later city of Babylon was more like New Babylon. Just like there's a York in northern England and there's a New York in America. And just like how, cities tend to have multiple names. So like New York can be called the Big Apple or Gotham, or sometimes they just call it the city, going over to the city. So now we essentially have the establishment of a pantheon by Yahweh. And Psalm 82 gives us more information about this. So Psalm 82, let's just read the whole thing because it's not long. It's only 8 verses. A psalm of Asaph, okay? God has taken his place in the divine council. Divine means like godly. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. So now, this divine council, it makes sense. Well, that would be the 70 who are God's right-hand guys. You know, in other words, like the sons of God would have been God's chief administrators, the princes of God. No one has more authority in God's kingdom than Yahweh. And then directly under him would have been his sons. 70 sons, okay? That would have been the divine council, okay? But now Yahweh is judging them. So he's not happy with them. And he has all these judgments. These are all moral condemnations. It says, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Selah. Which means like reflect on that. So let's do that. In the ancient world, there's not really much. The ancient polytheistic religions didn't really have much of a moral component. Like there was a little bit, but for the most part, no. They didn't really concern themselves that much with the moral nature of the humans that worship them, that serve them. So for example, in ancient Greece, Zeus was concerned that you showed hospitality to strangers. That was a big thing. But at the same, you didn't, so if someone new came to town, you didn't just kill them, but you would, take care of them. But at the same time, Zeus was pretty bad. He would lie, cheat, and steal every chance he got. And, humans didn't exactly see a moral problem with that. Or, for example, in ancient Egypt, they did seem to have, when you died and you wanted to go before Osiris and, get into the afterlife, they did have, they would, weigh your heart. And if your heart weighed more than a feather, then you were bad and you wouldn't get to go to the afterlife. But, if you had, so that's where they had the idea of a heavy heart. And the three of the things that would cause you to have a heavy heart would be: do not steal, do not murder, and do not lie. Have you lied? Have you murdered? Have you stolen? So there's a little bit of that, but it's like that's about it. For the most part, in these ancient religions, the gods were terrible examples. They did all sorts of bad things, for example, Inanna, remember, she wanted to sleep with Gilgamesh and he wouldn't sleep with her, so she conspired to have his best friend killed. That was pretty much the norm. Betrayal, lies, cheating, taking power. So, and there's no, so there's glimmers of good morality, but it seems to be overshadowed by a lack of it. And so what you have here is polytheism set up by Yahweh, and then God's not happy with polytheism. So now in other words, you've got a third rebellion here. You had the first rebellion with the serpent in the garden. You had the second rebellion with the Nephilim in Genesis 6 and murder world. And then you've got a third rebellion where, the new gods have replaced the old gods. And this story is very similar. It's very common in pretty much every ancient mythology to have some sort of arena of old gods, and then there's a war, and the new set of gods replace them with the new order. And that's what Genesis is talking about. It has a totally different spin on it, because it has this Yahweh who is the administrator of the whole thing, and he has what he wants to happen, and then you have these rebellions, and he's not happy with it. So instead of, so for example, the Titans were the gods who were the fathers of the Olympians, and they were giants, and the Titans come in, and Zeus and the Olympians come in, and they use their special powers. Zeus gets the thunderbolt, and they defeat the Titans, and then now the Olympians rule the world, and their pantheon. That's essentially the idea here. So but the Old Testament tells it in a different way, where it's and now Yahweh's not happy with the pantheon. Okay, so anyway, we'll go into more what it says here in Psalm 82. It says, "Give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked." Okay, so Yeah, the lack of a belief in charity certainly was an issue in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt. I mean, well, in general, none of these cultures show any awareness that like slavery was wrong. Um, I mean, they have no. There's like no concept of that. So that would be an issue. Uh, well, I mean, that's a whole other issue. I've got a video on that. If anyone's listened to me for this long, you probably watched all my videos. But like, I've got a video on that. It's called "Christianity Defeated Slavery," and it talks about the historical backdrop of that. So anyway, I mean, the whole idea of just charity, as far as I know, it doesn't appear in the ancient world except for under Ashoka. Ashoka did seem to have a concept of charity, of helping the poor, in ancient India. Although in India, it's like there were all kinds of other things that ran contrary to that. So anyway, this is what Yahweh says about his rebellious sons. He says, "They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die, and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit the nations." So this is the idea that now Yahweh is going to come back and take back what's his, because he gave it out to his sons, and all they've done is corrupt it. And so in other words, like, the sons of God were supposed to lead these peoples in the right way. These peoples were getting way off at Babel, but then they don't do that. They wind up receiving worship from these peoples and corrupting the earth. Okay, so Yahweh doesn't give up. He makes Abraham his inheritance, and what he's going to do through Abraham. So if these rebellious Elohim want to keep what they've got to keep God from being successful in what he's going to do through Abraham and Israel. So now they need to corrupt Israel. That's all they have to do. Because see, the thing is, God doesn't give up on what he says he's going to do. He's still working through the descendants of Adam to make the world fit to be in his presence. And you have all these rebellious Elohim who are trying to stop it, and God makes all these specific claims like, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how I'm going to do it, and so they use that as like a way to stop him from doing it, but he just keeps on doing it. So anyway, we need to take a look at the Acts 17. There's, because like, how do we take that in a pre-Adamic view versus an original pair view? There's particular things. So, in Acts 17, Paul is going to speak, to the Athenians, and he's talking about polytheism and the different gods they worship, and he's introducing them to the idea of Yahweh of the Old Testament. So this could be very interesting for us and for what we're talking about. And so anyway, let's start Acts 17, verse 16. It says, "Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols." So so understand, those idols he sees as Elohim, who God gave authority to rule, and now they are become rebellious themselves. And so his job as a Jew, and especially now as a Christian, is offensive. It is aggressive to retake the world because of this, this rebellion that's happened. It says, so Paul reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and devout persons. So devout persons would be non-Jews, would be Gentiles who wanted to follow Yahweh but probably weren't comfortable with getting circumcised and becoming a full Jew. Okay. And it says, and in the marketplace every day with those who happen to be there. So the marketplace would have been like the main, it's like the internet of the ancient world where everybody gets together, and it's the main place for that. Okay. but it would have been also where you buy and sell stuff. Okay. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also converse with him. Okay, so Epicureans and Stoics, the Greek philosophers, through their philosophy, had come to believe that they had come to reject polytheism to a degree. They had come to believe that there was one God through logical arguments, but they made allowance for the worship of their traditional gods, of their Greek pantheon, that those gods were somehow in the service of the one God. And this is something that they came to through their philosophical reasoning. Okay, and the Epicureans and the Stoics had different ideas on it. The Stoics were very anti-charity. They believed that the one God had created this like sub-God who could then interact with you. And then like that sub-God cared for you and loved you so much that like you should never be upset and you should never be emotional because everything's fine. So you should be stoic. And anyone who is needy, the Stoics saw giving to the poor as an emotional weakness, as a failure of your own faith that, you know, God has got everything under control and you need to not worry about anything. So they were totally against what Psalm 82 says. The Epicureans were different from the Stoics. The Epicureans said that the one God, you know, is so far beyond us that he couldn't possibly care what happens to us. So, you know, just enjoy your life for today. They didn't, to my knowledge, they didn't, their phrase was seize the day, carpe diem, you know, which is a Roman version of it. So, like, that helps us kind of understand. They saw God as so transcendent that he couldn't possibly care about us. And so Paul's going to come in and basically disagree with both of them. And it says, and some said, what does this babbler wish to say? Others said, he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. So one of the things that the Greeks did, you know, especially at Athens, is, you know, they believed in their pantheon, but they wanted to know about every god everywhere and add them to their list of ones they worshipped. Even though the belief would be that there were certain gods who were in charge of certain locations, still they want to make sure they make sacrifices to all of them. Okay, so because they think Paul is teaching about a new God that they haven't heard of before, it says, and they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what is this new teaching you're presenting? Well, the Areopagus, one of its duties would be the commission of building of a new statue to a new God. Okay, one of its jobs, or Mars Hill. Okay. For you bring some strange thing to our ears, we wish to know what these things mean. Now the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend all their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. All right, so it says, so Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Okay, well, he's going to immediately say, well, there's one God you don't know about, the real God that's the only God that really matters, Yahweh. He says, what therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. Okay? So they believed, remember, that the gods they worshipped would inhabit the idol and then live in there. And then they would bring it food, and that would literally be the house of the god. Okay? And it says, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything. Again, they believe that the gods like would get hungry and like you could feed the god and do things for the god, and then the god would be grateful that you did that, and but they literally believed the god needed things. Okay. He says, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. All right, it says, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. Okay, so Babel. So it's easy to read that and think it's talking about Adam. You know, Adam and Eve were the original pair, and then he made one man from all of that. But this is, determine the allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. Every nation, it's the creation of the nations is right there at Babel. Would that be every nation on the face of the earth? Every people group on the face of the earth? Every culture? Okay, so this gets more complicated. In this view, the nations are divided up and sent out. So let's just let's well, hold on, before we move forward, let's read the next verse. It says, when he divided them up, it was so that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is not actually far from each one of us. So, in other words, what God did at Babel was not, he wasn't like totally cutting himself off, but they needed to get to God in the right way, instead of what they were trying to do. So anyway, if you take a pre-Adamic view, then there are other people on the earth who essentially have been corrupted by the serpent. Probably by the time you get to Babel, they've probably been corrupted by the serpent. And you've got numerous rebellions happening among the people that God promised to use to bring the world into a right relationship with him. So Adam and his descendants are the ones who are supposed to bring the world into a right relationship with God. And they are becoming just more and more corrupted, and God keeps, doing things to correct it. And then the dispersal of the nations, each with their own gods that he assigned to them, would have been one of those things. So, it fits quite nicely here. He made from one man, Noah, the table of nations, 70 nations, and they each have their own God. But he's the one who made them. So the God that you think is the God of your nation was actually made by the one God. And this pantheon of gods that you think each to get collectively rule all the nations, all of that was set up by Yahweh. Okay, so the issue here is like, what we have to ask ourselves, okay, what would these rebellious Elohim do? Well, they would go and corrupt the earth just like Satan would, and then in the Nephilim story, given that God wants to make the world fit to be in Yahweh's presence through Adam and his descendants, then they're not only going to corrupt them, they're going to turn the world into what they want it to be. And so they're going to go out, and now that they've been given authority on the earth, they wind up rebelling, but they still have that authority. Okay? Yahweh sends his people Israel to retake it piece by piece. Okay? And they begin in the land of Canaan with retaking it, and then what Christianity talks about is like a total retaking. So like, if you go to Acts, I think it's, chapter 3, and at Pentecost, and you have all these people from all these different nations that hear about Jesus in their own language, because all the Christians are speaking in tongues, about Jesus. Then those nations, they're all ones that are from the table of nations, but they're missing a few. And then if you look at in the New Testament, everywhere that Paul goes on his missionary journeys, he's checking things off the list of the table of nations that didn't get covered at Pentecost. And his final one that he has to go to is Spain, and that would have been the last one from the table of nations. So it seems like in the view here, the nations of the world are really the nations of the ancient Near East, and then everywhere else in the world are people groups that are essentially under that arrangement that God set up at Babel. That God set up an arrangement at Babel, dispersed the nations from Spain to Persia, and then everywhere else in the world is under that. In other words, like, those people groups would have been under those beings too. And the crazy part is like this story from Genesis 1 through 11 is told there's very similar versions with the flood, with the Babel event, with the war among the gods replacing the older gods. Like it's all in the Apkallu / Nephilim story. It's all, or you hear about it all around the world. In every ancient culture, or not every, but like it's found all over the place. And so that would lead to basically two possible conclusions. You could say like, okay, well, they're all descendants of Noah, and Adam and Eve too, but also Noah, and so the story was handed down from parents to children. Alternatively, you could say that like these rebellious Elohim went around the world setting things up in the way they wanted it to be because they had authority to do so given them by God, and when they rebelled they still had that authority, and now God's going to retake it, because the thing is God's plan to make the world fit to be in His presence is going to be through these people that He's given authority over the earth. And so He's going to work through the people, the descendants of Adam, the descendants of Noah, the descendants of Abraham, and then Jesus finally comes. So like this is Satan's world essentially, but God's going to retake it is the idea. And so, it says He made from one man every nation of mankind. Well, it's like, okay, that would be Noah. And then from Noah were divided out 70 nations, and each of those nations were assigned to them a specific god to rule over them. And those gods together formed the pantheon, and all these pantheons were believed in all over the place. Well, what about, for example, China or the Incan Empire or the Mayan Empire? They would essentially be, in the Pre-Adamic view, they would still be under the same Elohim. Although, would they be descendants of Noah? Not necessarily. But that's the question that arises, is when it says He made from one man every nation. Does that mean culturally they all came from Noah and what God did, Or does that mean like genetically? Okay, I feel a little bit dumb. I just realized something. Okay, it says, and He made from one nation, or made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. Okay, well again, it's like, and He made from one man every nation to live on all the face of the ancient Near East. Would be a completely legitimate reading of that. That they were, they would have totally, it wouldn't have been comprehensive totality even in the New Testament necessarily. That's just not something that's implied there. In fact, the word is not all the face of the cosmos in Greek. It's all the face of the Gi, which is the ancient goddess Gi, who's the earth goddess. So it doesn't necessarily imply that, Paul's talking about all the people groups that live on this planet or made from one man. The implication is that certainly the Athenians would have been, so I mean, you could translate it all the face of the land because it's all the face of the Gi, which Gi is the earth goddess. She's Mother Earth, but like it doesn't, and of course, all of the words they use tend to have connections to polytheistic terminology. And God creating different nations by creating different languages, and each with their own God over them and different cultures, and so each God comes to them and says, all right, this is are going to be our culture and language and our terminology. The Athenians would have been one of the ones that Paul needs to go to, and he's saying that Yahweh made all the nations of mankind that live on all the face of the land. Could easily be a reference to Genesis 6 and the Table of Nations, because that's when God creates nations and national distinctions, and they're created from Noah's descendants. and they're created at the Babel event. So that's probably what he's talking about. So this particular issue wouldn't really make a difference one way or the other, as far as a pre-Adamite view or an original pair view. It's just not. That's probably what he's talking about here. He's talking about the creation of nations, especially when it says he's having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. So, I mean, it really boils down to when it says live on all the face of the earth, does that mean comprehensive totality of everywhere there's earth, even places that they didn't know about? That's, that doesn't necessarily apply. So, yeah, I mean, now that I've noticed this, it's like, okay, yeah, that would have been what Acts 17 is talking about. It's talking about the Babel event. And those nations right there that are dispersed from the Babel event and the Table of Nations are all in the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean. And there's just no reason. That's what he's talking about, While we're wrapping up here, I guess, so like how would that work in a pre-Adamite view? Well, essentially, these evil beings, these evil divine beings, these evil gods would have had free reign to go around and corrupt the earth. And the humans who were supposed to run the world had essentially ceded that authority. I mean, there's even parallels to that in ancient mythology, because like for example, the Mother Earth goddess, and so like in Greek mythology, you've got the Sky Father god and the Mother Earth goddess Ge, and she's like she's like their authority's taken away, and then the Titans are the next generation that come in and take their authority away. And then the Olympians come in and take their authority away. Well, I mean, in a sense, from the view of the Bible, the original rulers of the earth were Adam and Eve. The mother and the father. And like they're the earlier generation of gods, but they're not gods. They're humans. But they were the ones who were supposed to rule the world. And, it's sort of a weird parallel, So like in Genesis 3, for example, after they're, God, right before, there's this verse that's tucked in right here before Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, but after they sin, it says the man, or Adam, called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all the living. So, again, this verse would make you think, well, okay, it would seem to favor an original pair view. It doesn't, actually. So this is crazy. The word that's translated living there is the Hebrew word che, and that's one I happen to know, and I was like, wait a minute, che? It's not the usual word. So, like, when you read living creature, that's nephesh, and that means like a creature that has a soul, which doesn't necessarily just refer to humans. But che is a broader term that basically means like just living creature, just living thing, period. So like, that's the word that's, like, if you go back to Genesis 1 and it says, God made the che, those are it's talking about the animals that God made there, like the livestock. And so it's crazy. Like the word che is just a generic term for so for example, here are the ways that the King James translates it. Translates it as live as a verb 197 times. Translates it as life 144 times. Beast 76 times. Alive 31 times. Creature 15 times. Running 7 times. Living thing 6 times. I would say it's got different uses. So it can be an adjective, which means living or alive. It can be a masculine noun, which means like your relatives or life, or things that sustain life. As a feminine noun, it can mean living thing or animal life. community. So it's just, living is probably a good translation of that, but it means living like in the word living in English just means like it can mean like a cockroach that you step on was living before you stepped on it. So it was among the living. So here's the point, like, was Eve literally the mother of like all animal life too? Because the word living in their language, or the word che, meant that. And then like the very next verse says, and Yahweh God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skins and clothed them. So it's like, what? Like, it makes a reference that would kind of include that she's the mother of all animals too. And then all of a sudden it's like, and then they killed some animals and wore them as clothes. Well, I think one way to make this make sense is that Eve is the mother of everyone metaphorically, or she was supposed to be. That Adam and Eve were supposed to change the world to being something that was fit to be in God's presence. Alternatively, you would have to say, no matter what you do, you have to say they don't mean all the living literally. You would have to say, like, when it says all the living, we have to take it metaphorically, because it's obvious from the text that she's not the mother of all the living. So, and living in their language would mean the same generic usage that it is in English. It just means any living thing. So, like in other words, like, that might be the best translation might be, the man called his wife named Eve because she was the mother of all living things. That is what the word really means in the original language. It's totally used, for beasts, like what was 70 times or something. So it's obviously not taken literally. So you have to take it metaphorically. So then the question becomes like, what metaphorical perspective do you prefer? So you could say, well, she's the mother of all the living, and that means like humans, not literally all the living, but it's just, it's focusing on how, humans are alive, Or you could take it metaphorically, and you could say, you could take the pre-Adamic view that there were other people, but they weren't living, because they were, it's this question of being in God's presence, and being, right to be with God, because the next thing that happens is they're cut off from the tree of life. And the story says, that God the animals are killed. Then it says, and so that Adam and Eve have clothes to wear made out of their skins. And then it says, then Yahweh God said, behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore Yahweh God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. So, Adam and Eve are no longer fit to have access to life, the tree that gives life. And yet, on the flip-flop, Eve will be the mother of life. So there's a lot going on there metaphorically, and you have to take it metaphorically. So it's kind of like, which metaphor do you prefer in that situation? I think that covers all the things that I wanted to talk about. The only other thing is, it's rather interesting. They found Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities near the Dead Sea that were destroyed by fire from heaven. There were some cities that were there in the right period. We date Abraham as best we can to around 19 to 1600 BC, and there were some cities that were destroyed during that period, in the right place at the right time by meteors. So that's just like crazy. But anyway, we did it. We made it. This is Genesis talked about. So anyway, thank you for a massive amount of attention if you've made it this far through this video. Have a lovely day. Alright guys, I want to come in here and record just a bit more about the Pre-Adamic View. There's one additional thing that in the course of making this video I've learned some things, but this is an important point, important enough to add in here. So let's think about it. The Pre-Adamic View. When you read through Genesis and when you arrive at Genesis 4, you are forced to do some kind of bad biblical interpretation. Genesis 4 kind of just forces you to do it. When I say bad, I just mean that it's typically a bad idea to create ideas on your own and then insert them into the text. But there's no way around it when you get to Genesis 4. So one way, to do that with Genesis 4, to kind of make sense of what the text is saying, is to say there were other humans that already existed before Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve aren't the first humans. Okay, that's one way of reading Genesis 4. Okay, and then if you read it that way, then you have to additionally assume that those humans have a limited moral consciousness, because we know that Adam and Eve are supposed to be God's representatives. They're the high priest and high priestess of God's temple. They have direct access to God. God is teaching them things. So, they're supposed to teach the world about good and evil and about following God. So, in the Pre-Adamic View, you've kind of got these two big assumptions that you have to make, and then you shove those into the text. You don't get them from the text. You come up with them on your own and shove them back into the text, which is generally a bad thing to do. But the problem is, with Genesis 4, you just have to do something like that. There's no other way around it. But the thing is, with the Pre-Adamic View, you've got those two big assumptions. First, that there were other humans that already existed, and that they had limited moral consciousness. Okay. Now, if you take an original pair view, then you still have to make some assumptions, because if you take an original pair view, then you have to assume God performed a miracle of giving humans the ability to interbreed with very close kin folks, and do massive levels of inbreeding and somehow not die from it. You just have to assume that miracle is not explicit in the text. It's not something you're getting from the text. You're just creating that in your own mind and then shoving it back in there to make the text make sense. So, that being said, there is an important point that I need to add to that. And it's that in the Pre-Adamic View, you don't really have to make two assumptions, you only have to make one. Because what is explicit in the text is that humans are originally created with limited moral consciousness. So if there are pre-Adamic humans, as soon as you say they exist, then they would have to have limited moral consciousness. And that is something that explicitly comes from the text. So that particular component of the Pre-Adamic View is not actually a forced in hypothesis. It's actually exegetical, not eisegetical. So exegesis is the good, right way to do things, where you exit out of, you're getting your ideas out of the text. What you think about the text comes from the text. Eisegesis is where you create an idea from outside the text, and then you're reading that back into the text in between the lines somehow. And the thing is, Genesis 4 forces you to eisegete, to come up with some sort of theory for what this is talking about. It leaves some things unexplained. Maybe in the future we'll figure it out. But for now, it seems like that's where you're stuck. Okay. And my point for you is there's not really two big assumptions with the Pre-Adamic View. There's only one. And what I'm going to do, we'll just sort of walk through it here. You've got Adam and Eve created, or originally it's just Adam. Okay, so Adam is created. All right, and so in Genesis 2, Adam is created, and God forms them, and then there's this temple garden that God has created. All right, and says in Genesis 2:15, Yahweh God took the man, the Adam, and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. Okay, so given that it's a temple and it's also a garden, there will be a lot of work to do, but it's also a temple, so this is sacred space. So Adam is here to maintain sacred space. Okay, so there's no way around it. There had to have been some sort of short list of duties. You don't give somebody work to do without giving them a to-do list. He has to have something that he's supposed to do. Do this and not that. Do this, do this, do this. Adam, there's plenty to do when it comes to gardening. So, this is a key point. Okay. The assumption would be that if God hadn't done that Adam didn't originally live in the garden. That Yahweh took Adam and put him in the garden to do those things. So this is an actual lesson. And then we have an additional lesson about how he's supposed to maintain the garden, that he's told that he cannot eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Okay, so the clear implication would be that if God hadn't told Adam that, Adam wouldn't have known that. Okay, so then we need to ask this question about, okay, is this tree some sort of poison tree that God put in the garden, and it'd be like, having a nursery full of small toddlers and just putting a loaded handgun in there, or something like that, Well, not necessarily. There's a temptation to draw basically a false dilemma where the tree is either a bad thing or it's a good thing, and since it's bad to eat from it and bad things happen when you eat from it, it must be a bad thing. This tree, it says it's in the midst of the garden, and the word, it literally means it's in the middle of the garden. Okay, so I think it's Tavek or something. I looked it up on the thingy. I've got I'm using the Blue Letter Bible, which helps you look up Hebrew words, for people who don't know Hebrew like me. But anyway, it does, from what I saw in there, it does mean in the middle or at the halfway point. So you don't, Yahweh's not going to build a temple and then put something evil right in the middle of the temple. This is something I learned from a YouTube channel I was watching today. So I've learned things in the course of making these videos, but it's a pretty obvious point once it's pointed out to you. It's the tree wouldn't have been evil, given that it's in the very center of the garden. But that lends itself to the conclusion that instead of being evil, the tree would have been sacred. What do you put in the very center of your temple? The sacred objects. And do you just touch sacred objects or treat them any way you want? No, you have to treat them with tremendous care and respect. And you can't trifle with them or treat them trivially. So this is a simple concept that most people get, that it's just like little children are told not to giggle and laugh in church, because church is holy, the church is sacred. Every child has had to have that lesson all throughout history. We all know that during sacred services, children don't cut up and laugh and play. Okay, so that doesn't mean that church is a bad thing, or that, sacred services are a bad thing, but you also can't, just play and do however you want. Okay, so anyway, moving forward, it says Yahweh God said it's not good that the man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him. Well, I think that term, so fit for him is a weird thing. This is what I get from Dennis Prager's Genesis commentary. He's Jewish, but he says it means an equal, in the sense of if a boxing match or something, or two football teams that are evenly matched. And then the term helper, it could mean well, people need help with all sorts of things. So, like, the woman is created to just do what exactly? It's pretty broad. Well, no. Once we have this concept of, like, yeah, Adam had all kinds of work to do, then as high priest, then an equal helper would mean she's the high priestess, and that she's supposed to help him do this work. But then God teaches Adam this lesson it appears through bringing all these animals, and Adam names the animals, and then it says that he doesn't find a suitable helper, and then God creates them, presents them to him, and then Adam is like, okay, this is the one. He even says, at last, this is at last, is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. So Adam names her woman, or Adamah. So that's her name. Okay, woman. Adam is going to give her a new name later on, and that's going to be important. Originally her name is, he's Adam, which means man. Her name is Adamah, which means woman. Okay, so let me just double check. Oh no, it says Ishisha. Okay, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. So her name is Ishisha. Ishisha. Woman, wife, female. Woman, opposite of man. Wife, woman, married to man. Okay, so female. Okay, so, alright, Ishisha. Alright, so Adam names her that. Well, see, he's learned another lesson here. So, in other words, Adam has learned another lesson about being God's high priest. That he doesn't need to be doing this alone. He needs this woman to do it too. And that the right way to do things and the good way to do things is this way. So, what you have here is Genesis 2 and 3 actually take Adam and Eve, and it lays out a clear sequence where they have basically, everything we see that they know about right and wrong and good and evil are things that they learn in the process. So, like, the presumption would be, and what's clearly here is that without them having learned these lessons in the various ways that they learned them, especially through God just straight telling them things, is that they have a limited moral consciousness, except for the fact that God teaches them lessons. So, therefore, any other humans that God created in a pre-Adamic model would also have a limited moral consciousness, except for the fact that God teaches them lessons. Okay. Now, just to make the point more clear, we're going to go on. There's other lessons. So, Adam and Eve are here, and then it says, the man and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed. Okay, so they have no concept that they need to be wearing clothes. They don't need to be running around naked. Just like little 2-year-olds just run around naked, and they have no concept that, like, they shouldn't be doing that. Okay, you've got the serpent here in Genesis 3, verse 1. Okay, there's no reason to think that the serpent is actually in the garden, in the sacred space. Because, how big was the garden? Like, maybe Adam and Eve, maybe they worked there, but they didn't, like, stay in there all the time. Okay, so, and the idea as priests, they wouldn't necessarily stay in there all the time, especially if they're God's representatives to the rest of the world. Okay, so anyway, the serpent says, ask him, eaten by the tree. And then Eve, or actually the woman, at this point she's not Eve, responds and says, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it lest you die. So here she's clearly added something to God's command. It's not really the right thing for her to do because she's putting words in God's mouth. But does she know that she's not supposed to do that? Is it sinful? Yes, in a sense, because it's not really good or it's not really the way God wants her to be. But she maybe doesn't know any better, that she shouldn't be adding to God's commands like this. And so maybe, as Paul says in Romans 5, it's where there is no law, it is not held against your account. Okay, well anyway, in this situation, the implication would be that, like, they seem to think that they're going to die on the spot, that God's going to thunderbolt strike them down. Okay. So all that being said, they eat from the tree, Yahweh shows up, and it says, when they eat from the tree, says, then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. And then the next thing happens, they hear Yahweh walking around in the garden in the cool of the day, which would imply direct physical presence. So, yes, this is a temple, okay? The God is walking in the garden, okay? Yahweh God of all gods, all right? So then it says, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yahweh God among the trees of the garden. But Yahweh called to the man and said to him, where are you? Because, I mean, his role is to be in the presence of the God, okay? And he said, I heard the sound of you walking in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. And then here's the important verse I'm pointing out right now. Here's my focus verse. He said, this is Yahweh speaking, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? So who told you that you were naked? The implication would be that if Yahweh or someone else had told Adam he was naked, that Adam would have learned about wearing clothes through that method. That this is something Adam could have learned another way. If God could have taught this to Adam and Eve, student-teacher style, or maybe more like parent-to-children style. Okay. They didn't have to learn it through eating of this tree that gave them supernaturally, knowledge of good and evil. Okay. The implication would be this is a lesson they could have learned another way. They didn't learn it in the way, they didn't learn it the way that they learned other things. Okay. But there's one more lesson that they learn, all right, because after all of this, God pronounces, his judgment on them. And his judgment is not that they're die on the spot, but they will eventually die. And they're going to have a lot of work to do in their life. And so Adam gives his wife a new name at that point and names her Eve, which literally means life. And so the implication becomes like, okay, we're not going to be struck down dead on the spot. And then we have this additional, in God's judgment, God judges the serpent and says that, the woman is going to have children, and those children are going to become the enemy of the serpent, and, all of that. So, the implication is, Adam has learned another lesson here, Adam and Eve both, that, instead of God giving up on them and just striking them dead on the spot, they're still alive. And there's a continued hope that God's going to continue to do what he set out to do originally. And God has made this promise, that Eve is going to have these offspring, and through all of this, there's going to be a defeat of the serpent and the serpent's offspring. So, in this text, offspring doesn't necessarily mean, the serpent wouldn't necessarily have to, have literal offspring, because in the next chapter we read that, so-and-so was the father of all those who make metal things, and so-and-so was the father of the people who make the musical instruments, and so-and-so was the father of the shepherds, and, he's not literally the father of those people. It means, they fathered it in, a figurative sense. Okay, so, anyway, because, other people, ideas work like that. Once the cat's out of the bag, other people start doing it. You don't have to, be a descendant of somebody to use their ideas. So anyway, we've got 4 lessons here. Four things. So Adam starts out not knowing, presumably nothing. Then he's given a list of duties performed in the garden, and specifically told not to eat from the sacred tree. Then God teaches him a lesson about how to perform his duties. He really needs this woman, okay, to do them correctly. Okay, And then they learn that they're naked, and the implication would be that they could have learned that by being taught it the way they learned other things. And then they learn that God's not giving up on them. They're going to continue to live. They're going to eventually die, but they're going to continue to live, and God's going to continue to carry out his original plan through them. So life continues. So he renames his wife Life. Okay. So that makes the point that, I'm here to make, is that in the pre-Adamic view, the big assumption, the only real assumption you have to make is that there's other humans, which, you're forced to make some sort of assumption when you get to Genesis 4. It's like, what do you do here? What do you do with the fact, with these issues in Genesis 4? Now, some people take the view that back in Genesis 1, when it says that, God created man in his own image, that is a creation of humans. And then Genesis 2 talks about the creation of Adam, and then later the creation of Eve as two specific humans with specific jobs, where they're clearly the high priest and high priestess in God's temple. And they're clearly starting out with not knowing anything, having, potentially no moral consciousness, and then moral knowledge of good and evil. I guess I say moral consciousness, but the Bible says knowledge of good and evil. And then they're progressively, there's 4 lessons they learn there. So that we're explicitly told. So no matter what, Adam and Eve are God's representative, and they have direct access to God, and they're learning lessons from God that would then be, they would, to represent to the rest of the world. So the assumption would be, in that model, it's like, okay, well, what if Genesis 1 is talking about God creating humans the way he created the beasts of the earth and the livestock and the birds and the sea creatures? You don't look at God's creation of the birds and think God created one boy bird and one girl bird. Like, God created the birds. There's no reason in Genesis 1 to think they were just one boy and one girl of each thing, and then they had massive, inbreeding to populate them all. There's just that's not, you don't get that from Genesis 1. That's not present in Genesis 1. So in that view, then if you wouldn't think that from Genesis 1 about man and woman, if you didn't read the later stuff about Adam and Eve, if you just read Genesis 1, you would think that humans were created as a group. Okay, so, or as an en masse creation, instead of a specific original pair creation. Well, in that case, if humans were made in God's image as God's representative, then it's a job title that they are as yet unqualified for. And then Adam and Eve clearly are unqualified for it, and they are learning about how to do it. So, whereas all humanity is supposed to be God's representative and fit to be in God's presence, Adam and Eve are actually in God's presence, but they still have a lot to learn, and then they mess up, they get demoted, but God's not giving up on them. Okay. And there's a clear distinction between the humans and the other creatures. So, for example, the sea creatures and the birds, it says God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the seas and let the birds multiply on the earth." But when we get to humans, it says, "And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over this, yada, yada." So, that is the classic distinction between animal life and humans in the ancient world. Humans speak. Humans have language. Animals do not. That is the classic distinction in the ancient world. I've read that in plenty of things. That's the distinction they make between animal life and human life. Animals don't talk. Humans talk. Okay? So, nonetheless, there's no implication here that they're really given much of a command other than to just sort of take dominion over the world. Well, when humans emerged on this planet, the scientific evidence tells us that's exactly what they did. I mean, when they came to North and South America, there's a 90% extinction rate. But humans are the the only species that can live like anywhere on this planet as far as land goes, as far as the earth goes or the Eretz goes. So, that being said, I don't, at this point right now, I don't see a problem with this view that Genesis 1 is talking about en masse creation, and then Genesis 2 goes to, after God had created that, he creates two special humans with a special job of like being his high priest and high priestess and making the world fit to be in his presence. They would be, Adam and Eve would be God's representative too, because all humans would be made in God's image. But Adam and Eve would clearly be much better equipped for that, being that they're in God's presence, learning lessons from God, and that God isn't giving up on them, and that God is even making this promise that he's going to do something through their specific descendants that's going to complete his original mission. Okay, so there's all of that. I don't know. I may find in the future there's some big problem with the idea that Genesis 1 is an en masse creation and Genesis 2, is after the creation week. I don't know. More research is needed, but I felt like going ahead. I've learned a bunch, and I felt like certain enough about enough of it to go ahead and post this as it is, and just let it roll from there. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, thank you for your time.